They handed her over like currency, bruised, silent, expected to disappear. Jane Whitmore had 24 hours left to live, traded by her own mother to Chicago's most feared crime lord. The insurance policy was already signed. The body wouldn't even need to be hidden. But when Marco DeLuca lifted her chin in that dimly lit room and saw what had been done to her, something inside the untouchable Mafia boss cracked open. And the woman who sold her daughter's life had no idea she just made the worst transaction of her career. The nightmare of that transaction had officially begun just hours earlier. The rain came down in sheets that night, turning Chicago streets into rivers of neon and shadow. Jane Whitmore sat in the back of a black sedan, her wrists bound with zip ties that had already cut into her skin. She didn't bother looking out the window. There was no point. The city had stopped being home the moment her mother's hand connected with her face 3 days ago, the final beating in a lifetime of them. The driver didn't speak. Neither did the man beside her, a muscle-bound enforcer whose name she had never learned and didn't want to know. They were delivering a package. That's all she was now, a debt payment, a transaction. Her mother's voice still echoed in her head, syrupy sweet and venomous all at once. "You finally become useful, Jane." Imagine that. Useful. The word tasted like copper and shame. The sedan pulled up to a building that didn't look like much from the outside. Industrial brick, forgettable, the kind of place you would drive past without a second glance. But Jane had heard the stories. Everyone in Chicago had. This was DeLuca territory. And Marco DeLuca didn't just run an empire, he was the empire. Untouchable. Ruthless. The kind of man mothers warn their daughters about, except Jane's mother had gift-wrapped her and sent her straight to his door. The zip ties were cut. Rough hands pulled her from the car. Rain soaked through her thin dress within seconds, plastering dark hair to her face. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Falling felt like surrender, and she had done enough of that already. Inside the building transformed, polished floors, soft lighting, the scent of expensive cologne and leather. 2 more men flanked her as they walked her down a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat screaming, "Run, run, run." But there was nowhere to go. There never had been. They stopped in front of a heavy oak door. One of the men knocked twice, then pushed it open. The office was warm, unexpectedly so. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the rain-soaked city, lights blinking like dying stars. And behind a massive mahogany desk sat Marco DeLuca. He was younger than she had imagined, mid-30s maybe. Dark hair swept back, sharp jawline, eyes the color of smoke. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, charcoal gray, no tie. His hands were folded on the desk, and he didn't move when she was shoved into the room. "Leave us," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that made you listen. The men hesitated. "Boss, she is." "I said leave." They left. The door clicked shut behind them. Jane stood dripping on his expensive rug, arms wrapped around herself, waiting for whatever came next. Pain, probably. Humiliation. Death, if she was lucky. Her mother had explained it all with that practiced smile, the one she used on everyone who didn't know better. The insurance policy had been taken out months ago, $2 million. Jane just had to die for it to pay out. And what better way than a violent accident in the criminal underworld? Tragic. Unavoidable. Profitable. Marco DeLuca didn't speak. He studied her instead, gray eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Not because it was predatory, though she had expected that, but because it felt like he was seeing her, actually seeing her. And Jane hadn't been seen in so long she had forgotten what it felt like. "Sit down," he said finally. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her legs had locked up. He sighed, rising from his chair with the kind of fluid grace that came from absolute confidence. He was tall, broader than she had expected. He crossed the room, and Jane flinched. An automatic response her body had learned years ago. Flinch first, brace for impact second. But the impact didn't come. Instead, Marco stopped 2 feet away, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly as he studied the bruises on her face, the split lip, the finger-shaped marks on her throat, the way she held her left arm close to her ribs because breathing hurt. "Who did this to you?" His voice was still quiet, still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted, gone sharp and cold. Jane opened her mouth, closed it. Words felt dangerous. The truth felt impossible. "I asked you a question." Not harsh, just expectant, like he genuinely wanted an answer. "My mother," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and damning. Marco's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. He reached up slowly, telegraphing every movement like he was approaching a wounded animal. His fingers caught her chin, gentle, so gentle it made her throat close up, and tilted her face toward the light. She stopped breathing. He examined her the way a jeweler might examine a stone, cataloging every fracture, every imperfection. The bruises, the cuts, the haunted look in her brown eyes. When he finally released her, his hand fell back to his side, and Jane swayed slightly, dizzy from holding her breath. "Sit," he said again. This time her legs obeyed. She sank into the leather chair across from his desk, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Marco returned to his seat. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he pulled a crystal decanter from a side table, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, and set it in front of her. "Drink." "I don't." "It is not a request." She picked up the glass with trembling hands. The whiskey burned going down, but it cut through the fog in her head, sharpened the edges of the world just enough that she could think again. Marco watched her, waiting. "Why am I here?" Jane's voice came out raspy, fairly above a whisper. "You tell me." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I was told a delivery would arrive tonight, payment for a debt your mother owed. What I wasn't told was why she would send her own daughter as collateral." Jane barked out a laugh, sharp, bitter, edged with hysteria. "Collateral? Is that what she called it?" Marco's eyes narrowed. "What would you call it?" "An execution." The words spelled out before she could stop them. "She took out a life insurance policy, $2 million. All she has to do is wait for you to kill me, and she collects." The silence that followed was absolute. Marco didn't move, didn't blink, but something in the room shifted, temperature dropping by degrees until the air itself felt dangerous. "Say that again," he said softly. So she did. She told him everything. The policy, the planned accident, the way her mother had smiled while explaining how easy it would be, how no one would ask questions if Marco DeLuca's organization was involved. She told him about the beatings that had gotten worse over the past month, designed to leave marks, to build a narrative of abuse that would make her death look inevitable. She told him about the years before that, the control, the isolation, the way her mother had shaped her into something small and silent and easy to erase. And when she was done, Marco DeLuca sat perfectly still, his face carved from granite, eyes burning with something that might have been rage if rage could be that precise, that focused. "She set you here to die," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes. And you came anyway." Jane's laugh was hollow. "Where else was I supposed to go?" She made sure I had nowhere, no money, no friends, no one who would believe me over her. She met his eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look away. "So yeah, I came. Because at least. This way it is over." Marco stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough to make Jane flinch again. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the rain-slipped city. "Do you know what I do?" he asked. "You run the DeLuca family. You control half of Chicago. You kill people who cross you." Her voice was flat, reciting facts like a grocery list. "Yes." He turned to face her. "I do all of those things, but I don't kill women. And I sure as hell don't kill women who have been beaten half to death and handed over like livestock." Jane blinked. That wasn't what she had expected. Then what are you going to do with me? Marco's smile was thin, dangerous, and entirely without humor. I am going to make your mother regret every decision she has ever made. But first, I am going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. She nodded, throat tight. Do you want to live, Jane? The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before, not in all 26 years of her existence. She had been told what to do, where to go, how to act. She had been molded and controlled and beaten into compliance. But no one had ever asked what she wanted. Her voice cracked. I don't know. That is honest. Marco moved back to his desk, leaned against it, arms crossed. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to stay here tonight. You are going to eat, sleep, and see a doctor. Tomorrow, when you are thinking clearly, I am going to ask you again. And if the answer is yes, if you want to live, then we are going to figure out how to make that happen together. Why? The question burst out of her. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I am nobody. You are somebody who walked into a death trap with her eyes open because she didn't see another choice. That takes a kind of courage most people don't have. His expression softened, just slightly. And your mother made a mistake thinking I would be her weapon. I don't appreciate being used, so consider this a professional courtesy and a personal insult I intend to repay. Jane's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something unfamiliar and terrifying in its own way. Hope. Marco pressed a silver button on his desk. The heavy oak door opened almost instantly, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, assessing eyes and an elegant black dress. Not an enforcer. Something else entirely. Elena, Marco said, his voice returning to that quiet, steady baseline. Take Jane upstairs to the East guest suite. Get her whatever she needs and call Dr. Ramos. Elena's gaze swept over Jane, taking in her battered, soaking wet state without a single ounce of judgment or pity. Of course, boss, she murmured. Jane stood up on unsteady legs. She looked at Marco, at this dangerous man who should have been her brutal executioner, but who was instead offering her sudden sanctuary. I don't understand you, she said quietly. Marco's smile was faint, barely a shadow on his lips. You will or you won't. Either way, you will be alive to figure it out. Elena led her out of the massive office and through hallways that felt like stepping into another universe. The harsh, unforgiving noise of the city completely faded, replaced by thick, soft carpets, framed artwork that probably cost more than Jane had ever seen in her entire life, and a profound silence that felt like safety instead of suffocation. They took a private elevator up 3 floors. When the polished doors slid open, Jane stepped into a space that made her aching chest tighten. The guest suite was massive, bigger than the rundown apartment she had shared with her mother. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the shimmering, rain-soaked city skyline. A king-size bed sat in the center with impossibly soft-looking white sheets, and through an open archway, she spotted a pristine marble bathroom with a deep soaking tub. Everything was clean, elegant, untouched. The closet has basic clothing, Elena said. Her voice brisk but remarkably kind. Fresh clothes, toiletries. If you need something specific, use the phone on the nightstand. Press 1. Someone will answer immediately. Jane nodded numbly, rainwater still dripping from her ruined dress onto the expensive hardwood floor. Elena moved toward the door, then paused, her expression shifting into something almost maternal. The doctor will be here in 20 minutes. She is very discreet. She won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Thank you, Jane whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a gratitude she didn't know how to process. You are safe here, Elena said softly. Whatever you think is going to happen, whatever you have been told all your life, none of it is true. Marco DeLuca is many things, but he is not a monster to people who don't deserve it. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Jane entirely alone. She stood frozen in the center of the massive room and finally felt the hardened dam inside her crack. She barely made it to the bathroom before the sobs came. Ugly, wrenching sounds tore out of her chest like they had been trapped there for a decade. She sank to the floor, wrapped her arms around her bruised knees, and cried until there was absolutely nothing left. When she finally stopped, the silence of the room wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She peeled off her soaking wet dress, caught sight of herself in the grand mirror, and froze. The bruises were much worse than she had thought. Angry purple and yellow blotches mapped across her ribs, her arms, her throat. Her split lip was swollen, her cheekbones hollow and pale. She looked like a battlefield, a walking monument to her mother's cruelty. She ran the bath because standing in a shower felt like entirely too much effort for her trembling legs. The water was scalding, almost painful, but she sank into it anyway, closing her eyes and letting the intense heat seep deep into her aching bones. She stayed there until the water went tepid, until she felt vaguely human again. Dr. Ramos arrived exactly when Elena had promised. She was a woman in her 50s, with incredibly kind eyes and steady, gentle hands. She examined Jane with clinical efficiency, asking for permission before every single touch, cataloging the injuries without any unnecessary or pitying commentary. 2 cracked ribs, severe contusions, mild dehydration. "You are much stronger than you look," the doctor said softly as she packed away her stethoscope and bandages. Most people would have collapsed by now. Jane didn't feel strong. She felt like fractured glass held together by sheer stubbornness, but she accepted the painkillers and nodded her thanks. After the doctor left, Elena returned carrying a silver tray laden with hot soup and fresh bread. Jane ate mechanically, her body demanding the nourishment even though she couldn't taste a thing. When the bowl was empty, Elena took the tray and gently dimmed the overhead lights. "Get some sleep," she instructed quietly. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." Jane climbed into the massive bed, and the sheets were exactly as soft as they had looked. She should have felt terrified, out of place, like an intruder waiting to be caught and punished. Instead, as the rain continued to drum a steady rhythm against the reinforced glass windows, she felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a small child. She felt safe, and for the first time in recent memory, as utter exhaustion finally pulled her under, she did not dream about drowning. Morning came with soft light filtering through the sheer curtains and the rich, dark smell of freshly brewed coffee. Jane woke disoriented, her heart racing as her eyes started around the unfamiliar room, before the memory of the heavy rain and the massive mahogany desk crashed back into her mind. She was not in her mother's sterile, suffocating house, nor was she in some cheap, forgotten motel. She was here, deep inside Marco DeLuca's fortress, tucked away in a room that felt entirely like a sanctuary. She sat up slowly, testing the ache in her ribs, wincing as the dull throb reminded her that the nightmare was still very real. A soft knock at the heavy wooden door made her tense instinctively. "It is Elena," came the quiet, measured voice from the other side. "Come in," Jane managed, her voice thick with sleep. Elena entered carrying a silver tray laden with steaming coffee, sliced fruit, and warm pastries, setting it gently on the bedside table. "Mr. DeLuca would like to see you after you have eaten, whenever you are completely ready." Jane rubbed her eyes, glancing toward the window. "What time is it?" she asked. "Just after 9 in the morning," Elena replied smoothly. Jane had slept for almost 12 hours, a deep, unbroken sleep she had not experienced in over a decade. She ate simply because Elena stood there watching with a quiet, maternal expectation, and because saying no felt like an impossible task. The coffee was absolutely perfect, strong and grounding, while the fresh fruit and pastries practically melted in her mouth. Her battered body absorbed the nourishment like a drowning person finally gasping for air. When she was finished, Elena moved toward the massive walk-in closet, revealing a pristine row of clothing perfectly stocked in Jane's exact size. There were soft denim jeans, thick cashmere sweaters, and simple, elegant dresses. Nothing flashy, just comfortable, high-quality garments meant to make her feel human again. "How did you?" Jane started, but Elena merely smiled. Mr. DeLuca is extremely thorough, Elena said, handing her a pair of jeans and a pale gray sweater. Get dressed. I will wait outside. Jane dressed quickly, catching her reflection in the bathroom mirror once more. The bruises had certainly not faded, but they looked less raw, less defining in the gentle morning light. She pulled her dark hair back, splashed cool water on her face, and tried to look like someone who actually knew what she was doing. She felt like a fraud, but she tried anyway. Stepping out into the hallway, Elena led her back downstairs, weaving through different, brighter corridors this time, eventually arriving at a sunlit room that looked nothing like the intimidating office from the night before. This space was significantly warmer, thoroughly lived in, with tall bookshelves lining one wall and a worn leather couch facing a massive window that overlooked a lush, private garden. Marco DeLuca sat at a small round table, reading a morning newspaper with a steaming coffee cup in his hand. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, looking entirely at ease in a world built on violence. He looked up the moment she entered. Sit, he commanded softly. Elena disappeared back into the hallway, silent as a ghost. Jane sat across from him, wrapping her arms around her ribs. Marco folded the newspaper, setting it aside as he studied her with that same cataloging, assessing gaze from the night before. How do you feel? He asked. Like I got hit by a speeding truck, Jane replied. Honest. Accurate, Marco mused. He poured her a fresh cup of coffee and slid it across the smooth table. Dr. Ramos said you will heal perfectly fine. The cracked ribs will take a few weeks, but the rest is just surface damage. Jane wrapped her trembling hands around the warm ceramic cup, profoundly grateful for the heat. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice steadier now, sharpened by the daylight. I told you last night, Marco replied. No, I mean really. What do you offer me? She pressed, holding his. Intense gray eyes. Nobody does something like this without wanting something back. Marco leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and for a fleeting moment, she thought he might be genuinely offended. But then the corner of his mouth quirked upward into something that might have been a smile. You are significantly smarter than you pretend to be, he noted. I had to be, Jane fired back. Stupid girls do not survive in my mother's house. Marco tipped his head in acknowledgement. Fair point. So here is the absolute truth, Jane. Your mother actively tried to use me. She set up an intricate scenario where I would be blamed for your brutal death, where she would profit $2 million, and where I would be none the wiser. That completely pisses me off. So yes, I absolutely want something from you. I want your full cooperation in making sure she pays for that exact insult. But I am not going to force you. If you want to walk out that front door right now, you can. I will give you enough money to disappear, a completely clean identification, and a massive head start, with absolutely no strings attached. Jane's throat tightened as she processed the impossible offer. And if I stay, she whispered, then we make her deeply regret every single decision she has ever made. His voice dropped, going dangerously cold. Together. The word hung between them in the sunlit room like an unbreakable vow. Jane carefully set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking again, but not from the familiar, suffocating fear. This tremor came from a sudden, boiling anger, from something fierce and burning that she had spent her entire 26 years tamping down into the darkest corners of her soul. What exactly would that look like? Jane asked, her breathing shallow. Marco smiled, and this time, it was not kind. First, we keep you alive publicly. We make it explicitly clear to the entire city that you are under my personal protection. That alone will send a terrifying message to her. Second, we gather undeniable evidence. Everything she has ever done, every financial crime, every lie she has told to maintain her pristine image. And third, he paused, his smoke-colored eyes glittering with lethal intent. We expose her completely in front of everyone she has ever tried to impress. We strip away the things she values most. Jane felt a shiver trace down her spine. Her pristine reputation, Jane breathed. Exactly, Marco confirmed. She will fight back. She always does, Jane warned, remembering the venom in her mother's voice. Let her, Marco said, his tone sounding like solid steel wrapped in soft silk. She is fighting someone who actually knows how to completely ruin a life. Jane looked at this imposing man, this notorious criminal, this lethal killer who should have terrified her to her very core, but instead, sitting across from him made her feel something dangerously close to powerful. "Why do I trust you?" she asked, almost to herself. "Because I have not lied to you yet," Marco answered plainly. "And because deep down in your bones, you know I am the only real chance you have got." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, closing the distance between them. "So, I am asking you one more time, Jane. Do you want to live?" This time, the answer came easily, rising from the deepest, most unbroken part of her spirit. "Yes," she said firmly. "Good," Marco stated as he stood up, extending his large, scarred hand across the table. "Then let us get started." Jane reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, incredibly warm, and completely steady. And for the absolute first time in 26 years, she felt like she was shaking hands with a true ally instead of a cruel enemy. Maybe even a friend. The heavy rain from the previous night had finally stopped. Outside the large window, the city of Chicago glittered brilliantly in the morning sun, sharp and bright and full of endless possibilities. Jane Whitmore had spent her entire existence making herself small, remaining silent, and trying to be entirely invisible. But standing there, her small hand securely clasped inside Marco DeLuca's protective grip, she felt the tectonic plates of her soul permanently shift. She was done disappearing. And the cruel woman who had sold her life for a paycheck had absolutely no idea what kind of storm was coming for her. The first lesson in dismantling a life came that very same afternoon. Marco led her away from the sunlit garden and down into the reinforced belly of the estate, past a heavy steel door that required both a key card and a fingerprint scan. Beyond it lay a room that hummed with the quiet, relentless energy of a high-tech surveillance hub, lined with glowing monitors and servers, but Marco steered her toward a simple, polished conference table in the center. The surface was completely covered in thick manila folders, glossy photographs, and stack after stack of printed documents. Jane immediately recognized her mother's looping, elegant handwriting on the top file, and her traumatized stomach violently turned. "Sit," Marco instructed softly, pulling out a heavy leather chair for her. She sank into it, staring at the paper mountain as if it were a coiled snake ready to strike. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the cold, climate-controlled room. "Your mother's actual life," Marco replied, taking the seat directly across from her. "Every hidden transaction, every calculated lie, every single corner she has cut for the past decade." He reached for the thickest folder and flipped it open, pushing it across the smooth table toward her. Inside were high-resolution photocopies of bank statements, offshore transfer records, and property deeds. "Charlotte has been skimming heavily from the children's charity she runs," he explained, his tone entirely matter of fact, as if he had seen this exact breed of monster 1,000 times before. $10,000 here, $20,000 there. The amounts were carefully calculated to be small enough not to trigger state audits, but frequent enough to fund a remarkably luxurious lifestyle. Jane's bruised hands curled into tight fists in her lap, her fingernails digging crescent moons into her palms. "She always told me the charity barely broke even," Jane breathed, her chest tightening. "She said we could never afford anything extra." Marco slid another, even thicker folder across the table, his gray eyes locked onto her pale face. "She lied. She also holds 3 completely different bank accounts hidden under anonymous shell corporations, offshore holdings tucked away in the Cayman Islands, and a massive luxury condominium in Miami that she purchased entirely with cash." He tapped a manicured finger against the damning papers. Your mother is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million, Jane. And she deliberately made you believe you were completely broke." The room violently tilted. Jane gripped the cold edge of the table, desperately trying to breathe through the sudden, suffocating surge of absolute rage building in her chest. $8 million. She let the massive number echo in her mind. While she had spent her teenage years meticulously supergluing the peeling soles of her only pair of winter boots, her mother was hoarding millions. While Jane had eaten cheap ramen noodles in the dark because her mother claimed they could not afford to keep the electricity running, her mother was buying beachfront real estate in cash. While she had been told over and over, beaten into her skin and carved into her psyche, that she was a heavy burden, a massive drain, and a total waste of precious resources, Charlotte was living like a secret queen. Why? Her voice came out strangled, raw with the agony of a lifetime of deception. Why would she do that to her own daughter? "Absolute control," Marco answered, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, dangerous understanding. "Money gives a person options, and options give a person power. She intentionally kept you powerless, isolated, and entirely dependent on her, so you would never have the means to escape." Jane looked up at him, her vision suddenly blurring with hot, furious tears that she fiercely refused to shed. Marco reached into the pile and produced one final, painfully thin folder, setting it gently in front of her. "And this is the final piece of the puzzle," he said quietly. Inside was the pristine, official copy of the life insurance policy. $2 million, with Jane's name clearly listed as the insured, and Charlotte Whitmore proudly named as the sole, uncontested beneficiary. The stamped date at the bottom was from exactly 4 months ago. "She took this out right after you turned 26, Marco explained, watching her absorb the lethal timeline. "You are finally old enough that she could no longer claim you as a dependent on her taxes, and old enough that your sudden, tragic death in a dangerous city would not raise as many uncomfortable questions." Jane stared at the date, the black ink burning into her retinas. "She planned this," Jane whispered, the horrifying realization clicking perfectly into place like the final chamber of a loaded revolver. It was never a sudden decision born of financial desperation. It was a calculated, slow-moving execution. She could clearly see the entire blueprint now. The escalating violence over the last few months, the deliberate isolation from her few acquaintances, the careful, methodical construction of a public narrative where her eventual death would seem completely inevitable, perhaps even merciful. "How long have you known about this?" she asked, tearing her eyes away from the paper to meet his steady gaze. "Since last night," Marco admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I made several calls the moment you went to sleep. Your mother reached out to an associate of mine 2 weeks ago. She said she had a debt payment coming and asked if I would be willing to accept alternative collateral. I told her to deliver the package personally because I wanted to look at whatever she was offering." Marco's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering under his skin. "She assumed I would not ask any questions. She assumed I would take one look at a battered, broken girl and see nothing but an opportunity to exploit. She was entirely wrong." Jane stared at the vast sea of evidence spread across the table, at the undeniable, meticulously documented proof of her mother's profound betrayal. A small, cowardly part of her soul wanted to look away, to run back upstairs and pretend she had never seen the ugly truth hiding behind her mother's flawless smile. But the rest of her, the broken girl who had firmly shaken the hand of Chicago's most feared Mafia boss that morning, wanted to memorize every single damning word. She traced her fingertips lightly over the insurance document, the fragile paper feeling heavier than stone. "What exactly do we do with all this?" she asked, her voice dropping the last trace of its former tremble. Marco slowly gathered the scattered folders, squaring their edges and stacking them into a neat, lethal weapon of paper and ink. "We use every single page of it," he promised, his tone completely devoid of mercy. "But we do not strike yet. Your mother is going to eventually realize you are not dead, and she is going to come looking for you to finish the job. When she finally steps into the light, You need to be strong enough to face her without breaking." Jane lifted her chin, the ghost of her mother's final slap still aching on her cheek, but a new fire igniting in her brown eyes. "I will not break," she vowed, the words slipping out fierce and vicious. Marco studied her face, his expression softening into something remarkably close to pride. "Then I suggest we get to work." The transformation began the very next morning in a subterranean level of the estate that looked more like a professional fighting ring than a basement. Marco led Jane through a set of heavy double doors into a sprawling gym outfitted with thick rubber mats, swinging heavy bags, and a long wall of mirrored glass. Waiting for them in the center of the room was a woman with sharp, angular features, dark hair pulled back into a tight, merciless braid, and faded scars that told silent stories of brutal survival. "Jane, this is Risa," Marco said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous, brightly lit space. "She's going to teach you exactly how to defend yourself." Risa looked Jane up and down, her gaze entirely clinical and stripped of any condescending pity. "Have you ever been in a physical fight?" Risa asked, tossing a pair of black hand wraps onto the nearest weight bench. "Not one I ever won," Jane answered honestly, her voice tight with residual shame. Risa offered a grin, approving nod. "Good. That means you do not have any bad habits we need to unlearn. We will start with the absolute basics. How to stand, how to move, and how to throw a punch without shattering every single bone in your hand." Marco lingered by the doorway for a brief moment, offering Jane a quiet, grounding look. "You have got this," he murmured, before leaving her to the grueling work ahead. For the first 2 hours, Jane felt like an absolute fraud in her borrowed athletic gear. Every instinct wired into her nervous system over 26 years screamed at her to curl inward, to protect her vital organs, to make herself as small and invisible as humanly possible. When Risa lunged forward without warning to demonstrate a defensive block, Jane violently flinched, throwing her arms up and squeezing her eyes shut in an automatic posture of utter surrender. Risa stopped her fist mere inches away, her breathing perfectly even. "See that?" Risa pointed out, not unkindly, but with a firm, uncompromising edge. "You pull away. You shrink down into yourself. That is exactly what a predator expects you to do. Instead, you need to step inside their guard. You close the distance, take away their leverage, and you use their momentum against them." They drilled the fundamental movements over and over until Jane's cracked ribs protested with blinding, white-hot agony and her muscles trembled with profound exhaustion. It felt completely backward and entirely dangerous, forcing her traumatized brain to override a lifetime of painful conditioning. But Risa was completely relentless, correcting her sloppy stance without mocking her, pushing her past her perceived limits without breaking her fragile spirit. By the end of the first week, the grueling physical conditioning was matched only by the intense psychological teardown. Marco personally took charge of her mental reshaping in his sunlit office, replacing the physical strikes with verbal and postural drills designed to eradicate her victim mentality. "Stop apologizing for simply taking up space," Marco demanded one afternoon, leaning against his massive mahogany desk as Jane paced across the expensive Persian rug. "You made yourself smaller the second Elena walked into the room this morning with our coffee. You drop your eyes when anyone addresses you directly. You say thank you for basic human decencies you do not ever need to be grateful for." His voice was firm, resonant, and deeply commanding. "Your mother spent decades training you to disappear. I need you completely visible." Jane swallowed hard, her throat tight with the terrifying prospect of finally being seen. "I do not know how to be visible," she admitted. Marco stood up, gesturing toward the far wall. "Then we start right now. Walk across this room. Do not slouch. Do not drop your gaze. Act like you completely on the ground beneath your feet." It sounded incredibly simple, but it was agonizingly difficult. Jane stood, her shoulders automatically curving inward to protect her chest, and took a hesitant step. Halfway across the room, she caught herself staring at the intricate patterns on the rug and forced her chin up. It felt horribly wrong, obscenely exposed, like she was begging to be struck. Again, Marco commanded. She walked back, desperately trying to straighten her spine, but her posture faltered under the weight of his stare. Again, he repeated. For a grueling hour, Marco made her walk back and forth across that room. Every single time she slouched, he corrected her. Every time her eyes darted to the floor, he called her out. It was exhausting and deeply humiliating, yet strangely liberating all at once. Finally, he held up the scarred hand. Better, he acknowledged, pouring her a glass of cold water from a crystal pitcher. Does it ever get any easier? Jane gasped, collapsing into a leather chair. Eventually, Marco promised, handing her the glass. Right now, you are actively fighting 26 years of intense conditioning. That takes serious time, but your mother weaponized your fear to control you. We are going to take that weapon away from her by making you completely untouchable. The days bled together into a blur of controlled, intentional chaos. Mornings were spent sweating and bleeding on the gym mats with Risa, hitting the heavy bag until her knuckles split and her lungs burned, slowly turning the flinch into a block and turning the retreat into a calculated counterattack. Afternoons were spent with Dr. Sarah Levin, the discreet trauma therapist Marco had hired, meticulously peeling back the calcified layers of emotional damage. Sarah taught her grounding techniques, breathing exercises to fend off the panic attacks, and methods to separate her mother's venomous voice from her own internal thoughts. And evenings were spent dining with Marco, absorbing his quiet strength, learning the intricate, ruthless politics of Chicago's elite circles, and meticulously mapping out the public destruction of her abuser. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the broken girl who had been dragged through the freezing rain began to fade away into memory. In her place, a lethal weapon was being carefully forged. A resilient woman who no longer looked at the floor, who learned exactly how to throw a devastating punch, and who finally realized, surrounded by the protective walls of Marco's fortress, that she was entirely worth fighting for. The false peace of the sanctuary shattered exactly 5 days into her training. Jane had retreated to her sprawling guest suite after a grueling session with Risa, her muscles aching with a new, powerful kind of soreness that felt like progress instead of punishment. She lay on the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, when she made the mistake of powering on the cracked, outdated cell phone she had brought with her from her old life. She had kept it buried in the nightstand drawer, terrified of the digital tether it represented. The moment the screen flickered to life, the device violently vibrated in her bruised hands. 17 missed calls, 42 text messages, all from Charlotte. Jane opened the inbox with trembling fingers, her breath catching as the venomous words filled the cracked glass screen. "Where are you? Answer your phone. This is unacceptable, Jane. You are making a massive scene. Call me immediately." The very last message, sent only an hour ago, made her blood run completely cold. "I know exactly where you are, and this will not end well for you." Jane stared at the glowing words, the familiar, suffocating grip of panic closing around her throat. Her mother knew. Of course her mother knew. A sharp knock at the heavy oak door made Jane violently jump, dropping the phone onto the soft mattress. "It is Marco," his quiet, controlled voice came from the hallway. Jane scrambled off the bed and opened the door. Marco stood there in a tailored charcoal suit, his jaw tight, holding a sleek silver tablet in his large hands. "Your mother just posted this," he said grimly, stepping into the room and turning the bright screen toward her. It was a social media video posted to Charlotte's public foundation account, the one followed by 500,000 people who genuinely believed she was a selfless saint. The video showed Charlotte sitting in her immaculate, sterile living room, wearing a simple pale sweater, her face devoid of makeup to highlight the dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, exhausted, and perfectly devastated. "My heart is completely breaking," Charlotte said in the video, her voice trembling with practiced, Oscar-worthy grief. "My sweet, vulnerable daughter, Jane, has been missing for over 5 days. She has struggled so deeply with severe mental health issues her entire life, and I am absolutely terrified for her safety. We have reason to believe she has been manipulated and taken by an incredibly dangerous individual involved in organized crime. Please, if anyone has seen my little girl, help bring her home to me. The hashtags missing person and help find Jane flashed across the bottom of the screen. Jane watched the view count tick upward in real time, jumping by thousands every single second. The comments were a pouring flood of absolute sympathy. Strangers offering heartfelt prayers, sharing the tragic post, calling Charlotte a remarkably brave mother. Jane's hands clenched into tight fists, her fingernails biting into her palms. "She is making herself the ultimate victim," Jane whispered, her voice shaking with a potent mixture of raw terror and blinding rage. "Yes, and she is incredibly good at it," Marco agreed, pulling the tablet away and setting it face down on the polished dresser. "This is exactly what I expected her to do. She is meticulously building a public narrative where you are the lost, deeply troubled daughter, and she is the endlessly suffering mother. When you finally turn up alive, she will immediately claim you were manipulated, violently kidnapped, and brainwashed by a brutal criminal." Jane looked up at him, her chest heaving as the walls of the luxurious room suddenly felt like a closing trap. "What do we do?" she asked, the old, conditioned helplessness threatening to pull her back under the dark water. "We let her play her desperate hand, and we let her genuinely think she is winning," Marco answered, his smoke-colored eyes entirely calm, radiating a cold, lethal certainty that anchored Jane to the floor. "She is using her public platform to back us into a corner, hoping you will panic and break cover." He took a slow step closer, closing the distance between them, his towering presence offering a shield against the digital assault. "She expects you to be the exact same terrified, silent girl she handed over to me in the rain. She expects you to crumble under the sheer weight of public opinion." "Are you going to crumble, Jane?" The question hung in the quiet room, a direct challenge to everything Jane had fought to rebuild over the past 5 days. She thought about Risa demanding she hold her ground. She thought about Dr. Sarah Levin teaching her how to silence her mother's toxic voice. She thought about the $8 million hidden in offshore accounts while she had starved in the dark. Jane looked at the silenced phone on her bed, then up at the untouchable Mafia boss who had given her a sword instead of a grave. "No," Jane said, her voice dropping the tremble and finding a new, solid resonance. "I am not going to crumble." Marco offered a thin, dangerous smile that promised absolute ruin for their enemies. "Good," he murmured softly, "because this viral video is just her opening move. She is setting the public stage to justify her next step. She involves the police." Jane's pulse kicked hard against her ribs at the mention of law enforcement, but she did not break his gaze. "Then let them come," she declared, surprised by the steady steel in her own voice. "I am ready." The inevitable fallout from Charlotte's viral performance arrived less than 24 hours later, interrupting Jane mid-strike in the subterranean gym. Risa had just instructed her to throw a left hook when Elena appeared in the doorway, her usually placid expression pulled tight with unprecedented tension. "Jane, you need to come upstairs right now," Elena said, her voice carrying a sharp urgency that made Jane's stomach instantly drop. Jane did not ask questions. She dropped her padded gloves on the mat and followed Elena through the winding corridors, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her healing ribs. They bypassed the sunlit kitchen and headed straight for the grand foyer, where Marco stood with his phone pressed hard against his ear, his broad shoulders stiff with lethal irritation. "I do not care what kind of warrant you think you have," Marco growled into the receiver. "You are not walking into my home without my legal counsel present." He ended the call abruptly, tossing the phone onto a marble console table as he turned to face Jane. "Your mother went to the police," he explained, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "She officially told them I kidnapped you. They're at the front gate right now demanding to do a welfare check." Jane's blood went entirely cold, her feet rooting to the polished floor. "Can they legally do that?" she asked, her voice sounding entirely too small. "Technically, yes, but I am not letting them inside without a massive fight." Marco's jaw tightened. "You are an adult. You came here completely willingly. They have absolutely no probable cause other than the hysterical tears of a local celebrity." He took a slow step closer, his towering presence shielding her from the heavy oak doors. "But this is her exact play, Jane. She is trying to force your hand, trying to make you choose between going back to her suffocating prison or turning this into a massive, highly publicized legal battle." Jane felt the familiar, suffocating panic rising in her chest, clawing at her throat. "I am not going back," the words tore out of her, fierce and desperate. "I do not care what they say. I am not going back to her." "Then we handle this right now," Marco stated quietly, his intense gaze anchoring her. "You are going to talk to the police. You are going to look them in the eye and tell them the absolute truth. That you are here by your own choice, that you are entirely safe, and that Charlotte is the one who hurt you." He reached out, his warm fingers lightly brushing her shoulder. "Can you do that without breaking?" Jane thought about the grueling past 2 weeks, the intense therapy sessions with Sarah, the agonizing hours spent learning how to block a punch, the slow and painful process of building herself into someone who could actually survive this war. "Yes," she breathed. "Good, because she is heavily counting on you falling apart. We are going to prove her completely wrong." 15 minutes later, 2 seasoned Chicago detectives were escorted into the formal conference room. Marco sat casually at the head of the long mahogany table with his sharp-suited lawyer present, radiating quiet menace. Jane sat directly across from the officers, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood, absolutely determined not to let them see her residual terror. The older detective, a woman with graying hair and incredibly tired eyes, studied Jane with blatant suspicion. "Miss Whitmore, we received a highly credible report that you're being held here completely against your will. Is that true?" the detective asked. "No," Jane answered, her voice completely unwavering. "I am here because I choose to be here." The younger male detective leaned forward, his posture aggressive. "Your mother seems to think otherwise. She is incredibly concerned about your mental state and your physical safety." Jane almost laughed, the sound bitter and sharp in her throat. "My mother is concerned about her pristine public reputation, not my safety." The male detective narrowed his eyes. "She showed us the frantic posts she made on social media. She explicitly stated you have been completely out of contact for weeks. That is not normal behavior for someone who is safe. What is not normal is a wealthy mother who violently beats her daughter and then files a fraudulent missing person report to cover up the crime," Jane fired back. She deliberately pushed up the sleeves of her gray sweater, revealing the angry, fading purple and yellow bruises painting her forearms. "She did this. And she did a lot worse over the past 26 years. You want to know exactly why I am sitting in this house? Because Marco DeLuca offered me genuine safety when the woman who gave birth to me actively tried to have me murdered." The 2 detectives exchanged a heavy, loaded glance. The female officer pulled out a small notepad. "That is a very serious accusation to make against a prominent public figure," she warned gently. "It is the absolute truth," Jane maintained, leaning forward, completely abandoning her defensive posture to claim the space exactly as Marco had taught her. "And I have the documented proof. Sealed medical records, financial documents showing the $2 million insurance policy she took out on my life right before the beatings escalated. Check my history. Talk to the doctors who treated me as a helpless kid. You will see the undeniable pattern." The intense interview lasted another agonizing 20 minutes. By the end of it, both officers looked distinctly uncomfortable, their initial hostility entirely deflated by Jane's calm, unwavering certainty. As they stood to leave, the older woman pulled a business card from her coat pocket and slid it across the table. "If you need absolutely anything, call this number. Victim Services can help you get out of this environment." "I am already getting the exact help I need right here," Jane replied, glancing briefly at Marco before looking back at the detective. "I am exactly where I need to be." After the heavy doors clicked shut behind the police, Marco's lawyer nodded approvingly and packed his briefcase, silently slipping out of the room. Jane sat completely still, the massive wave of adrenaline suddenly crashing down, leaving her trembling. Marco remained in his chair, his gray eyes warm and bright with undisguised pride. "You handled that perfectly," he said softly. Jane looked down at her hands, no longer bound by zip ties, no longer shaking with helpless terror. Her mother had played her strongest card, trying to use the law to drag her back into the dark, and Jane had simply looked the law in the eye and sent it away. She took a deep, shuddering breath, realizing she had just won her very first battle. "She is not going to stop," Jane whispered. "No, she is not," Marco agreed, rising from his chair and offering her his hand. "Which means it is time for us to finally take the offensive." The remaining days before the annual Chicago Children's Foundation Gala blurred into a hyper-focused symphony of preparation and controlled chaos. Marco transformed his sunlit office into an absolute war room, the massive mahogany desk completely covered with glossy photographs, detailed dossiers, and the intricate financial webs tying Charlotte to Chicago's wealthiest elites. Jane spent her evenings sitting across from him, memorizing the faces and secrets of the 500 influential people who would be attending the event. "Who is this?" Marco asked one evening, holding up a photograph of a silver-haired man in a sharp tuxedo. Jane stared at the image, her mind rapidly retrieving the data Marco had meticulously fed her. "Richard Carmichael," she answered smoothly. "He owns 3 luxury hotels downtown, sits directly on the board of my mother's charity, is married to someone 20 years younger, and secretly has a massive gambling problem that he desperately thinks nobody knows about." Marco nodded with grim satisfaction, setting the photo aside and pulling up another. "And this one?" he prompted. "Patricia Weston," Jane recited without a single hesitation. "A ruthless real estate developer. She absolutely hates my mother, but fiercely pretends not to because they constantly compete for the exact same wealthy donors." Marco leaned back in his leather chair, a look of genuine approval crossing his sharp features. "You are getting incredibly good at this," he noted. "I feel like I am studying for a massive final exam I never actually signed up for," Jane admitted, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of coffee. "You are," Marco agreed softly. "Except if you fail this particular test, your mother completely wins." He closed the thick dossier, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "These people are absolute vultures, Jane. They will smile warmly at your mother while she is useful to their social standing, and they will tear her apart the very second she becomes a liability. We just need to give them a very public reason." Jane absorbed his words, realizing that true power in this city was not just about brute physical force, but about leveraging hidden truths. The psychological preparation was equally as intense as the intellectual studying. Sarah increased their therapy sessions, teaching Jane how to build an impenetrable mental fortress, ensuring that when she finally stood in the same room as her abuser, she would not regress into the terrified child she used to be. Then came the physical transformation. Exactly 2 days before the gala, Elena appeared in Jane's sprawling guest suite carrying 3 heavy, opaque garment bags. "Mr. DeLuca had these specifically made for you," Elena said, carefully hanging them in the pristine closet. Jane unzipped the first bag and felt her breath physically catch in her throat. The dress inside was a breathtaking midnight blue silk, incredibly elegant and deeply understated. It was absolutely nothing like the flashy, uncomfortable cocktail dresses her mother used to force her into for public charity events to make her look like a compliant prop. This dress was highly sophisticated and quietly powerful, the kind of garment that made a definitive statement without screaming for attention. "Try it on," Elena encouraged gently. "Make sure it fits your frame perfectly." Jane slipped off her training clothes and stepped into the cool silk, realizing instantly that the dress fit as though it had been painted directly onto her healing body. It was not overly tight, just perfectly structured to grant her an armor of absolute confidence. She walked over to the full-length mirror and completely froze. She barely recognized the stunning, capable woman staring back at her. The brutal purple and yellow bruises had finally faded into pale, easily concealable shadows. Her dark hair had been expertly trimmed and shaped by a discreet stylist Elena had brought to the estate, falling in intentional, sleek waves instead of the neglected tangles she was used to. She looked like someone who genuinely mattered, someone who could not be easily discarded. "He has incredibly good taste," Elena murmured, reaching out to smooth an invisible wrinkle on Jane's shoulder. "He always has." Jane turned, studying her reflection from every possible angle, feeling the silk whisper against her skin. "Why is he doing all this for me?" "Really?" she asked, her voice tight with raw emotion. Elena offered a soft, knowing smile. "You would have to ask him that yourself, Jane. But if I had to guess, you reminded him of someone he once knew, or perhaps of himself a very long time ago." Marco DeLuca does not help people often, but when he finally does, he commits to it completely. "You are incredibly lucky." Jane looked back at her reflection, at the warrior standing where a victim used to cower. "I do not feel lucky," Jane whispered. "You are alive, are you not?" Elena countered smoothly. "And you are about to completely destroy the woman who tried to violently end your life. That is not luck, Jane. That is absolute survival." The final piece of preparation occurred the very next morning in Marco's private office. He had brought in a discreet cameraman to record Jane's official statement, the final nail in her mother's coffin that would play on the massive screens at the gala. Jane sat in a heavy chair facing the camera lens, wearing no makeup to hide the last fading remnants of her bruises, refusing to use a written script. She looked directly into the glass lens and spoke her absolute truth, detailing the horrific abuse, the systematic financial ruin, and the $2 million bounty placed on her head. When she finally finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy, profound silence. Marco stood by the window with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as the cameraman quietly slipped out of the room. "Was it too much?" Jane asked, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Marco shook his head, his voice rough with a deep, fierce emotion. "No," he promised her. "It is absolutely perfect. She will never recover from this." Jane stood up, feeling the final, heavy weight of her past lift from her shoulders forever. "Good," she stated, her chin held high. "Because I do not want her to." The black sedan rolled to a smooth stop in front of the Grand Marquis Hotel, the tires hissing softly against the wet pavement. Jane Whitmore sat frozen in the luxurious leather seat, her heart hammering against her healing ribs like a trapped bird. Outside the tinted windows, the entrance was a chaotic sea of flashing cameras and wealthy socialites arriving for the annual Chicago Children Foundation Gala. Tonight was the night. Marco DeLuca sat beside her, radiating a calm, lethal energy in a tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than a luxury car. He turned to her, his smoke-colored eyes entirely steady. "You do not have to do this," he reminded her quietly. "We can turn the car around right now, and my men will still tear her empire to the ground." Jane looked down at her hands, no longer bound by cruel zip ties, resting elegantly against the midnight blue silk of her dress. She took a deep, shuddering breath, drawing on every grueling hour she had spent on the training mats with Risa and in the quiet therapy room with Sarah. "No," Jane said, her voice finding its solid resonance. "I need to look her in the eye when it happens." Marco offered a slow, deeply approving nod, stepping out of the vehicle and extending his large, scarred hand to her. The moment Jane stepped out of the sedan, the cold night air hit her face, but she did not flinch. She placed her hand in Marco's, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of his grip. They bypassed the main press line, escorted by Marco's silent security detail through a private entrance that opened directly into the lavish grand ballroom. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 500 of Chicago's most elite figures. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, imported roses, and the melodic clinking of champagne flutes. They walked into the room fashionably late, and their arrival sent an immediate, visible ripple through the glittering crowd. Marco kept his hand resting firmly on the small of Jane's back, a steady, protective pressure that silently broadcasted a terrifying message to anyone watching. He was here, and she belonged with him. Jane kept her chin high, refusing to drop her gaze as she scanned the sea of faces. She easily spotted Richard Carmichael hovering nervously near the open bar and Patricia Weston holding court by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a calculating smile. But Jane's eyes did not linger on them. She was searching for one specific monster. She found her standing directly in the center of the ballroom, entirely surrounded by wealthy admirers and sympathetic journalists. Charlotte Whitmore looked exactly as she always did, elegant and pristine in a tailored cream-colored gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. She was wearing a flawless, practiced expression of profound maternal tragedy, undoubtedly playing the role of the grieving mother whose daughter had been ruthlessly abducted. Jane watched her mother dab at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue, and a sudden, fierce surge of disgust completely burned away the last remnants of Jane's fear. Just as Charlotte lowered the tissue, her gaze casually swept the room and landed directly on Jane. For one fleeting, glorious second, absolute shock shattered Charlotte's perfect mask. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling under the golden chandeliers. Then, with the terrifying speed of a seasoned predator, the mask slammed back into place, replaced by a hardened, desperate calculation. Charlotte quickly excused herself from the circling reporters and began marching across the polished marble floor toward them. Jane's pulse immediately quickened. Every ingrained instinct from 26 years of horrific abuse screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself as small and invisible as humanly possible. But she forced herself to stand completely still. She felt Marco step marginally closer, his presence a silent fortress at her side, but he let her take the absolute lead. "Jane." Charlotte called out, her voice dripping with sugary, artificial relief, loud enough for the rapidly silencing crowd to hear. "Oh, thank goodness. My sweet girl, I have been so incredibly worried about you." Charlotte reached out, her manicured hands extended as if to pull her daughter into a desperate, loving embrace. Jane took one deliberate step back, remaining just out of her reach. "Do not touch me," Jane commanded, her voice ringing out crisp and deadly clear. Charlotte's eyes went completely cold, flashing with a venomous fury that only Jane could recognize, but her public smile never wavered. "Darling, I know you have been through an unimaginably difficult time," Charlotte cooed, stepping closer and lowering her voice into a harsh, threatening whisper. "You are making a massive scene. We should go talk about this privately. This is not the place." "No," Jane replied, planting her feet firmly on the expensive marble, exactly as Risa had taught her. "We are not going anywhere, and we are certainly not talking privately in the shadows. Anything you have to say to me, you can say right here in the light." A heavy, suffocating hush began spreading rapidly through the nearby crowd as wealthy guests stopped their conversations to watch the unfolding confrontation. Cell phones were discreetly pulled from designer purses, camera lenses turning toward the tension. Charlotte's tight smile finally began to crock at the edges as she realized she was entirely losing control of the narrative. "Jane, you are clearly unwell," Charlotte declared loudly, pivoting to address the whispering onlookers. "This criminal has violently manipulated you. He kidnapped you from your home and poisoned your fragile mind." Marco let out a low, dark sound of amusement, but it was Jane who fired back. "Marco saved my life," Jane said, her voice carrying an unshakable, ringing authority that echoed across the silent ballroom. "You deliberately tried to end it. I know all about the hidden offshore bank accounts. I know exactly why you sent me to a Mafia boss in the dead of night. I know about the $2 million insurance policy." Charlotte recoiled as if she had been physically struck, raw panic finally erupting in her wide eyes. "That is utterly absurd," Charlotte gasped, trying to laugh, though the sound was hollow and frantic. You have clearly been fed vicious lies by a monster. Jane took one step forward, closing the distance, looking down at the small, pathetic woman who had tormented her for her entire existence. The only monster in this room is you, Jane stated with absolute, unwavering conviction. And in about 30 seconds, everyone standing in this building is going to know exactly what kind of horrific person you really are. Charlotte opened her mouth to scream a denial, but before a single word could escape her lips, the grand chandeliers above them suddenly dimmed into total darkness. The suffocating darkness lasted for only a heartbeat before the massive digital screens positioned around the perimeter of the grand ballroom simultaneously flickered to life. The sudden, glaring blue light illuminated the 500 stunned faces of Chicago's elite, casting long, eerie shadows across the polished marble floor. Charlotte froze, her manicured hand suspended midair, as the towering screens displayed a meticulously edited compilation. It did not begin with violence, but with cold, undeniable numbers. High-resolution images of pristine bank statements, hidden offshore account transfers, and deed documents for Miami real estate scrolled rapidly across the bright displays, each transaction highlighted in blinding yellow ink. The murmurs of the wealthy crowd morphed into a confused, agitated buzzing as they recognized the official corporate logo of the Chicago Children Foundation printed directly next to the drained charity accounts. Then, the undeniable truth of the embezzlement violently shifted into something far darker. The screens flashed a rapid series of sealed medical records, spanning over 2 decades of secret agony. Pediatric X-rays showing fractured ribs, emergency room admission forms detailing highly suspicious concussions, and heartbreaking photographs of a young, terrified Jane covered in blossoming purple bruises filled the massive room. The collective gasp of the audience sucked the oxygen straight out of the cavernous ballroom. Charlotte spun around wildly, her designer heels slipping on the marble, frantically searching for an exit or a sound technician to stop the relentless onslaught. "Turn it off," Charlotte shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "Turn it off right now." But absolutely nobody moved to help her. The security detail Marco had strategically planted firmly blocked the audiovisual booth, ensuring the broadcast remained entirely uninterrupted. The final document appeared on the glowing screens, filling every single display with the irrefutable proof of a $2 million life insurance policy, complete with Charlotte's looping signature and a stamped date from exactly 4 months ago. The heavy implications of the murder-for-hire plot settled over the crowd like a suffocating winter shroud. Then, the documents faded to black, and Jane's own face appeared on the giant screens. She was sitting in Marco's sunlit office, completely devoid of makeup, the fading shadows of her recent beating fully visible for the entire city to witness. "My name is Jane Whitmore," the recorded version of Jane stated, her voice booming through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, completely drowning out Charlotte's frantic sobbing. "And the woman you know as a selfless philanthropist, the woman who runs this esteemed charity, is the exact same woman who beat me, isolated me, and ultimately sold me to a dangerous criminal because she firmly believed I was worth more dead than alive." In the center of the ballroom, Charlotte collapsed heavily to her knees, the expensive cream-colored silk of her gown pulling around her on the cold floor. She covered her ears with her shaking hands, but there was absolutely no escaping the ringing, righteous clarity of her daughter's voice. "Everything you have seen tonight is the absolute truth," the digital Jane continued, staring directly into the camera lens with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "Every hidden bank record, every sealed medical file, every single photograph. She stole millions from the most vulnerable children in this city to fund her lavish lifestyle, and she tortured her own flesh and blood behind closed doors. This is who Charlotte Whitmore really is, and I am entirely done being silent about it." The devastating video abruptly ended, plunging the ballroom into a thick, ringing silence before the crystal chandeliers slowly flared back to their full, golden brilliance. The sudden light exposed Charlotte kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, her perfect mascara running down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. The influential donors, the powerful board members, and the elite journalists who had celebrated her mere minutes ago now stared at her with expressions of profound disgust and absolute horror. The tight circle of wealthy admirers that had previously surrounded her physically backed away in unison, stepping over the hem of her gown as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Jane stood tall beside Marco, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of 26 years of agonizing terror finally detach from her soul and evaporate into the chandelier-lit air. She looked down at the ruined, pathetic woman weeping on the marble floor, and for the absolute first time in her entire life, Jane felt absolutely no fear. The monster was dead, slain in the blinding light of her own vanity, and Jane was finally, undeniably free. The silence in the grand ballroom stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, someone dropped a crystal champagne glass. The sharp sound of it shattering against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, breaking the spell, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Charlotte lurched forward from her knees, reaching out for the nearest journalist with trembling hands. "This is completely fabricated, all of it," she desperately cried out. "That man," she pointed a shaking finger at Marco DeLuca, "he is a notorious criminal. He coerced her into making that video." Marco stepped forward, his voice completely calm, cutting effortlessly through her rising panic. "I have certified copies of absolutely everything," Marco stated. "Financial records authenticated by 3 separate forensic accountants. Medical records subpoenaed directly from 4 different hospitals. The life insurance policy filed with your exact signature, fully dated and notarized." He pulled a small silver flash drive from his tuxedo pocket and held it up to the glaring light. "Any journalist in this room who wants the complete, unedited file can have it tonight, completely free of charge." A dozen hands shot up into the air immediately. Charlotte's face went from a sickly pale to a mottled crimson. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked. "I will see for defamation. I will see for slander." Jane stepped away from Marco's protective side, standing entirely on her own 2 feet. "For telling the absolute truth?" Jane asked, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly across this silent space. "You can certainly try, but we both know exactly what legal discovery will reveal." Her mother's wide eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, Jane saw something that almost looked like genuine desperation. "Jane, please," Charlotte begged, her voice cracking. "You do not understand what you are doing. I am your mother. I deeply love you. Everything I did was—" Jane cut her off abruptly. "Do not," Jane commanded, the words coming out hard and unforgiving. "Do not you dare say you did it for me. You did it entirely for yourself. You have always done everything for yourself." Charlotte's expression instantly twisted into something vicious and ugly. The grieving mother mask was completely gone now, stripped away by blind panic and raw rage. "You ungrateful little wretch," Charlotte spat. "After everything I gave you, you gave me nothing but ugly scars." Jane's voice did not shake, not anymore. "And I am completely done carrying them for you." A bright camera flash went off, followed by another, and then a blinding dozen more. The journalists were ruthlessly documenting everything, their phones and heavy cameras capturing Charlotte's massive public meltdown in real time. Richard Carmichael pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his face red with fury. "Charlotte, is this actually true?" he demanded. "Have you been stealing from the foundation?" Charlotte stuttered, reaching for him. "Richard, please, I can easily explain." Patricia Weston appeared right beside him, holding her glowing phone up like a weapon. "Can you explain $2 million sitting in offshore accounts?" Patricia asked, her smile sharp and predatory. "Because I am looking at the direct bank transfers right now. My personal accountant just sent me the breakdown. It is incredibly interesting how much of our donated money ended up in the Cayman Islands." Charlotte's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for allies, for anyone who might defend her honor, but the faces staring back were all exactly the same. Shock, deep disgust, and absolute betrayal. The wealthy people who had celebrated her an hour ago were already stepping away, rapidly distancing themselves from the toxic wreckage of her life. "This is not over," Charlotte hissed, turning back to glare at Jane. "You think you have won? You think destroying my life makes you strong? You are nothing. You have always been absolutely nothing. And when he eventually gets bored of you," she gestured wildly at Marco, "when he throws you away like the trash you are, you will have nowhere to go." The venomous words hit exactly where they were meant to, finding all the old, aching wounds. Jane felt the familiar, cold panic starting to rise in her chest, the dark voice in her head whispering that maybe her mother was right. But then Marco's warm, steady hand found hers, weaving his fingers through her own. And just like that, the rising panic stopped dead. Jane looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not the towering, terrifying figure of her childhood, but a small, vicious woman whose power had always come entirely from making other people feel small. "You are right about one thing," Jane said quietly. "I was nothing. You made sure of that. But I am not nothing anymore. And you." Jane let her steady gaze sweep over the ruined woman. "You're exactly what you have always been. Just now, everyone else can see it too." Charlotte opened her mouth to scream, but her voice was cut off by two men in dark suits pushing through the crowd, shiny gold badges visibly clipped to their belts. Jane recognized the older detective from the welfare check. "Charlotte Whitmore, we have several questions regarding severe financial irregularities at the Children Foundation," the detective stated calmly. "You will need to come with us right now." Charlotte's voice rose to a hysterical shriek. "I am not going anywhere. This is police harassment. I have basic rights." "You have the right to remain completely silent," the detective countered smoothly. "I would highly suggest using it. They were not arresting her yet, just bringing her in for formal questioning, but the wealthy crowd did not know that. All they saw was the pristine Charlotte Whitmore being escorted out of her own charity gala by the police, her perfect facade shattered beyond any hope of repair. Jane watched her mother disappear through the grand ballroom doors, and she felt something massive release inside her chest. It was not relief, exactly, but more like the sudden absence of a crushing weight she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand up straight. Marco's hand was still firmly holding hers. She looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I do not know yet," Jane admitted honestly, her legs suddenly feeling like water. "Ask me tomorrow." Marco nodded, wrapping a strong arm around her waist as the ballroom erupted into total chaos around them, journalists shouting rapid-fire questions while board members aggressively argued in tight clusters. He skillfully steered her toward a quiet side exit, leading her away from the flashing cameras and out into the cold, silent night, leaving the burning ruins of her mother's empire far behind them. The morning after the gala, the sprawling estate felt completely different, the frantic, suffocating tension replaced by a profound, hollow quiet. Elena brought coffee to the sunlit dining room, where Marco was already reviewing a stack of legal briefs with his sharp-suited attorney. Jane sat across from them, nursing her warm mug, watching the Chicago news networks continuously replay the shaky, chaotic footage of her mother being escorted into a police cruiser. Charlotte had posted a massive bail just before dawn, but her high-priced defense lawyers were already waving a white flag. "They want to discuss a settlement," Marco stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy as he slid a crisp legal document across the polished table. "Your mother is absolutely terrified of a highly publicized criminal trial. Her legal team is offering to surrender her position at the foundation and agree to a permanent restraining order if you refuse to press formal charges." Jane stared at the formal letterhead, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. "She wants me to just let her walk away," Jane whispered, the injustice of it burning the back of her throat. She wants to completely avoid a prison sentence, Marco corrected gently, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. I think it is an incredibly insulting offer. If you want her locked in a concrete cell, Jane, we can absolutely make that happen. The evidence we gathered is completely airtight, but you need to understand exactly what a criminal trial entails. It will take months, perhaps even years, of vicious legal battles. You will be forced to take the witness stand. You will have to look her in the eye while her defense attorneys try to aggressively tear your character apart and paint you as a delusional liar. It will be a relentless, grueling media circus. Jane closed her eyes, absorbing the heavy, exhausting truth of his words. She thought about the flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the endless public scrutiny of her deepest, most painful scars. She had just fought her way out of a 26-year nightmare, and the thought of anchoring herself to her abuser for another 3 years of court dates felt like a different kind of prison. What happens if I accept a settlement? Jane asked, opening her eyes to meet his steady, gray gaze. She does not go to prison, Marco answered plainly. But her life, as she knows it, is completely over. She is legally barred from ever contacting you. She loses her pristine reputation, her lucrative career, and her powerful social standing. We strip her to the bone. Jane looked down at the coffee in her mug, watching the dark liquid ripple. Prison felt like absolute justice, but forcing her mother to live the rest of her days in the exact same powerless, impoverished state she had forced upon Jane felt like poetic retribution. I will take the settlement, Jane decided, her voice growing stronger, but I have my own non-negotiable terms. Marco smiled, a sharp, dangerous curve of his lips. Name them, he commanded. I want her to formally admit to every single thing she did, Jane stated, her brown eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. I want a legally binding, fully written confession. The decades of physical abuse, the systematic financial embezzlement, the $2 million life insurance policy, all of it. And I want her to surrender every single penny of her $8 million hidden fortune to me as direct restitution. Marco's lawyer blinked in surprise, but Marco just let out a low, approving laugh. If she ever tries to publicly deny what happened, or if she ever tries to rebuild her empire, that written confession immediately goes to the press, Marco added, turning to his attorney. Draft the paperwork exactly as she requested. Make it completely airtight. The negotiations lasted exactly 4 grueling days, marked by frantic, desperate pushback from Charlotte's legal team, but Marco's attorneys held a merciless line. Charlotte had absolutely no leverage left. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the final settlement documents were delivered to Marco's office in a thick leather binder. Jane sat at the massive mahogany desk, her hands completely steady as she flipped through the thick, heavily worded pages. Charlotte Whitmore had signed a devastating 40-page document detailing every horrific crime she had committed, every vile lie she had told, and every single time she had raised a cruel hand to her daughter. She formally surrendered the offshore bank accounts, the Miami luxury condominium, and the hidden shell corporations. In return, Jane signed a single piece of paper agreeing not to pursue criminal prosecution. It felt incredibly surreal. After a lifetime of paralyzing fear, agonizing pain, and suffocating control, her ultimate liberation simply came down to blue ink on crisp white paper. But when Jane saw her mother's elegant, looping signature scrawled at the very bottom of that total confession, she felt the final, unbreakable chain snap and fall away. Her mother was completely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and permanently banished from Chicago, left to start over with absolutely nothing, exactly as she had always forced Jane to do. It is over, Jane whispered, running her fingertips over the indented signature. Marco stepped up behind her, placing a warm, grounding hand on her shoulder. Yes, it is, he agreed softly. You completely dismantled her. Jane leaned back into his touch, feeling a profound, quiet peace settle over her healing soul. The untouchable monster of her childhood had been permanently reduced to a pathetic, powerless ghost, and Jane was now standing in the light, holding the massive resources she needed to actually begin her own life. 3 months after the final settlement was signed, Jane stood in front of an abandoned, cavernous warehouse on the industrial south side of Chicago and tried to envision exactly what it could become. The massive brick building was a total disaster. Every single window was shattered, the roof was partially caved in, and decades of brutal neglect had turned the vast interior into something that looked more like a desolate crime scene than a hopeful future. But it was entirely hers. She had purchased the forgotten property outright using the exact settlement money her mother had been legally forced to surrender. Every single recovered dollar felt like a tiny, solid brick of absolute justice. "Are you entirely sure about this?" Marco asked softly, standing tall beside her with his hands resting easily in his pockets, his sharp gray eyes surveying the extensive wreckage with a critical, calculating gaze. "No," Jane admitted honestly, her breath forming a small white cloud in the crisp morning air. "But I am going to do it anyway." Over the past 12 weeks, Jane had been thinking heavily about Patricia Weston's surprising offer to join the Charity Foundation's board of directors. Jane had even attended a few formal meetings, sitting through endless, dry presentations about corporate fundraising and high-level donor relations. It was important, highly necessary work, but sitting in those pristine, sterile conference rooms, listening to wealthy people talk about helping vulnerable women in purely abstract, detached terms, Jane had realized a profound truth. She did not want to manage helpful programs from a safe, comfortable distance. She desperately wanted to build something real, something tangible that would have saved her life if it had only existed when she needed it most. A true shelter. Not the typical, institutional kind with rigid metal beds, buzzing fluorescent lighting, and draconian rules that felt exactly like another form of punishment. She wanted to build something entirely different. A safe place where women escaping severe abuse could actually heal, could relearn how to be whole again, and could finally discover they were worth so much more than what had been violently done to them. The radical idea had first taken root during one of her intense afternoon sessions with Dr. Sarah Levin. They had been discussing what genuine healing actually looked like in the real world, and Jane had mentioned how Marco's heavily guarded estate had felt like an absolute sanctuary. The undeniable safety of it. The way Elena had magically appeared with hot food and clean clothes without Jane ever having to ask or beg. The subterranean gym where Risa had patiently taught her exactly how to fight back. The quiet therapy room that had slowly helped her separate her mother's toxic voice from her own internal thoughts. What if other terrified women could have that exact experience? Jane had asked Sarah. Not just a cold bed and a random social worker's business card, but actual, comprehensive support from people who truly understand the darkness. Sarah had offered a warm, knowing smile and simply replied, "Then you should absolutely build it." So here she was, standing on the cracked pavement, staring at a massive warehouse that looked like it should be legally condemned, desperately trying to imagine it full of bright life, stubborn hope, and genuine second chances. Marco was already pulling his sleek phone from his coat pocket. "I know a highly reliable contractor," Marco stated, tapping the screen. "He owes me a significant favor. I can have his entire crew here tomorrow morning to formally assess the structural damage." Jane looked up at him. "Marco, you really do not have to." She started, but he gently cut her off. "I know I do not have to, Jane." "I want to," Marco said, his gaze entirely steady. "You are doing something incredibly good here. Let me help you." Jane had learned not to stubbornly argue when he used that particular, quietly commanding tone. Over the past 3 months, she had learned quite a lot about Marco DeLuca. She had learned that underneath the ruthless crime lord exterior was a man who deeply understood survival, who fiercely respected true strength, and who kept his word no matter what it cost him personally. She had learned that he was relentlessly loyal to the point of absolute stubbornness, that he valued quiet competence over empty sentiment, and that he harbored a surprisingly deep soft spot for broken, lost causes. Most importantly, she had learned that she trusted him infinitely more than she had ever trusted anyone in her entire life. It was a realization that was equal parts terrifying and deeply comforting. "Okay," Jane said softly. "Thank you." Marco made the call, his voice slipping back into the authoritative register that moved mountains in Chicago. Within a single hour, a gruff older man named Frank arrived in heavy work boots and a scuffed hard hat to walk through the ruined space. Jane followed them closely, clutching a notebook, trying not to feel completely overwhelmed by the massive scope of what she was attempting to do. Frank pointed out severe structural issues, highly dangerous electrical problems, and ancient plumbing that would need to be completely ripped out and replaced. "It is a massive amount of work," Frank said finally, running a calloused hand over a crumbling brick wall. "But the bones of the building are incredibly good. You have a very solid foundation and excellent ceiling height. It could be something truly special if you do it correctly." Jane asked the most terrifying question. "How long will it take?" Frank pulled out a battered notebook, scribbling rapid calculations. 6 months if you want it done fast. 8 months if you want it done properly. You will need city permits, safety inspections, the whole bureaucratic mess." Jane felt something bright and fierce spark in the very center of her chest. It was hope, or perhaps it was absolute purpose. "Let us do it properly," Jane declared. Frank nodded approvingly, already calculating the massive supply orders. "I will have a formal estimate for you by Friday." After the contractor left, Jane and Marco stood alone in what would eventually become the main common area, surrounded by thick construction dust, peeling paint, and the silent ghosts of what the building used to be. "You are really doing this," Marco observed, his voice holding no trace of a question. "Yeah, I really am," Jane replied, turning to face him fully. "I know it sounds completely crazy. I know I have absolutely no experience running anything like this. But I have to try, Marco. If I do not—" She stopped, searching for the right words to explain the fire burning inside her. "If I do not do something meaningful with what happened to me, then it was all just useless pain with absolutely no point. This way, maybe my past actually means something." Marco's sharp expression softened in a way she so rarely saw. "It already means something," Marco told her gently. "You survived. That is more than enough." Jane looked around the vast, empty warehouse, seeing not the ruin, but the brilliant potential. "Not for me," she whispered. "Not anymore. I want to build something real. I want to leave something behind that is infinitely better than what I found." Marco looked at her, his eyes reflecting a deep, unshakable belief. "Then you absolutely will," he stated, as if her eventual success was a simple, undeniable fact of the universe. Jane desperately wished she possessed that kind of absolute certainty, but maybe that was exactly what true faith looked like. Having someone fiercely believe in you when you could not quite believe in yourself yet. The grueling 8 months of construction slowly transformed the ruined South Side warehouse into a living, breathing sanctuary, but it also miraculously transformed the quiet space between Jane and Marco into something infinitely deeper. Every single day, amidst the chaotic swirl of drywall dust, demanding city inspectors, and endless arrays of paint swatches, Marco remained her steady, grounding anchor. He never once tried to forcefully take control of her vision. Instead, he quietly smoothed out the impossible logistical nightmares behind the scenes, securing discreet legal permits and ensuring the state-of-the-art security systems RISA had demanded were completely impenetrable without making the building feel like a clinical prison. Their exhausting evenings frequently blurred together over shared takeout boxes sitting on the newly installed hardwood floors, talking softly until midnight about deep trauma, fierce survival, and the complicated, terrifying process of learning how to genuinely trust another human being. Marco would listen to her fears with that intense, unwavering focus, his dark gray eyes tracking every micro-expression on her healing face, silently proving over and over that he was a man who kept his promises. When the bitter November wind finally ushered in the official opening morning of Phoenix House, Jane stood alone in the center of the massive common room, her heart swelling until it physically ached against her ribs. The freshly painted walls were a deep, welcoming blue. Soft, warm light poured through the reinforced, bulletproof windows, illuminating the plush velvet couches and the quiet, secluded therapy room Sarah had carefully helped her furnish. Risa had personally set up a complete self-defense studio in the basement, hanging heavy punching bags to teach terrified women exactly how to reclaim the physical space around them. It was not sterile or institutional in the slightest. It was a beautiful, fiercely protected home. The heavy front doors clicked open, and Marco walked into the foyer carrying a large cardboard tray of fresh coffee and warm pastries, looking entirely out of place yet perfectly right in his tailored charcoal suit. "You actually did this," Marco said softly, crossing the room to hand her a steaming cup. "You built a true fortress out of your own ashes." Jane wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, looking up into the eyes of the lethal man who had given her a second chance at life. "We did this," Jane corrected gently, her voice thick with raw emotion as she stepped marginally closer to his solid warmth. Before Marco could respond to the heavy, unspoken weight hanging in the air between them, the secure brass buzzer at the front entrance abruptly echoed through the quiet hall. Jane's breath hitched in her throat. The moment of absolute truth had finally arrived. Elena, whom Jane had proudly hired as the head house manager, marched gracefully to the foyer and pulled open the heavy reinforced door to reveal their very first resident. The woman standing trembling on the threshold looked exactly like a shattered ghost. She was perhaps 20 years old, desperately clutching a small, battered duffel bag to her chest, her pale, hollow face marked by a fresh, dark purple bruise blooming violently across her left cheekbone. A tiny girl, no older than 4 years old, hid directly behind the woman's threadbare winter coat, shivering violently in the brutal Chicago cold. Jane looked at the terrified young mother and instantly saw the painful ghost of her own past, recognizing the desperate, hollow ache of a girl who had been violently convinced she was entirely worthless. But Jane was no longer that helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered in a dimly lit office. She was the shield. Jane stepped forward, her posture radiating the calm, unshakable strength she had forged over hundreds of agonizing hours on the training mats. "You are completely safe here," Jane said, her voice incredibly gentle but laced with an absolute, lethal certainty. "Nobody is ever going to hurt you. Again. I promise you that." The young woman let out a broken, shuddering sob, her weakened knees buckling slightly as Elena rushed forward to gently wrap a warm blanket around her shaking shoulders and guide her inside the glowing foyer. The little girl peeked out from behind her mother's coat, her wide, frightened brown eyes suddenly landing on the brightly colored wooden toys spilling out of the dedicated children's playroom. Jane stood completely still and watched the heavy security door securely click shut behind them, sealing the brutal monsters of the outside world firmly away. She felt Marco step up right behind her, his large, warm hand coming to rest protectively on the small of her back. "She is going to survive her nightmare because of you," Marco murmured, his breath brushing softly against her dark hair. "She is going to survive because she was brave enough to choose to walk through that door," Jane replied, leaning her exhausted weight back into a solid, muscular chest, finally allowing herself to rest in his embrace. "I just gave her the safe place to do it." As the rich scent of coffee mingled with the beautiful, highly unexpected sound of a child's hesitant laughter echoing from down the hall, Jane closed her eyes. The invisible, broken girl who had been dragged through the freezing rain exactly 1 year ago was permanently gone. In her place stood the fierce, untouchable protector of Phoenix House, standing proudly shoulder to shoulder with Chicago's most feared crime lord, entirely ready to face whatever beautiful, complicated future awaited them. 3 months after the grand opening of Phoenix House, Jane sat in her quiet office reviewing grant applications late into the evening. The shelter had filled up incredibly fast, overflowing with women who arrived carrying their trauma like heavy luggage, only to slowly unfold within the safe, deeply protective walls Jane had built. She was just signing the final page of a funding request when a tall shadow fell across her desk. Marco stood in the open doorway, wearing a simple black sweater instead of his usual tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way she rarely witnessed. "You are still working," Marco observed, his quiet voice wrapping around her like a heavy, warm blanket. "So are you," Jane replied, setting down her pen and offering a soft, exhausted smile. Marco stepped into the room and gently clicked the door shut behind him. He looked incredibly serious, a profound weight settling in his striking gray eyes that made Jane's stomach perform a nervous flutter. "I need to tell you something," Marco said, taking the seat directly across from her desk. Jane braced herself, her pulse quickening. "Okay," she murmured. "I am getting out," Marco stated simply, as if it were not the most shocking, earth-shattering sentence he could have possibly spoken. "The family business, the underground empire, all of it. I am completely done." Jane stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "What? Why?" she asked, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of his words. "Because I am completely exhausted from living that life," Marco explained, leaning forward and resting his scarred hands on her desk. "I am tired of the endless violence, the suffocating paranoia, the constant, draining anticipation of waiting for someone to make a lethal move in the dark. I have been thinking about doing this for a very long time. Since the very first night I met you, actually. Watching you take the absolute worst, most agonizing wreckage of your life and rebuild it into something so profoundly beautiful and real made me realize that I could do the exact same thing. I can actively choose something different." Jane's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What are you going to do instead?" she whispered. "Legitimate business," Marco answered, his voice steady and completely certain. "I have entirely clean investments, legitimate real estate properties, and more than enough legal money to start completely over. And I want to help you here." He gestured around the quiet office. "With Phoenix House. Not financially, because you do not need my money anymore, but with security consulting, navigating the complex legal systems, and all the background operations that keep vulnerable places like this completely safe." The confession hung in the warm air between them, heavy with unspoken promises. "You want to work with me?" Jane asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to work with you," Marco confirmed, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I want to work for you. Whatever makes the most sense. Jane, I have spent 20 years building an empire of fear that I do not even want anymore. Watching you save these women made me realize exactly how empty my entire life has been. I want to be part of something genuinely real. And I want to be around you while I do it." He paused, reaching across the desk to gently cover her trembling hand with his own. "I am saying that I am completely in love with you, Jane. I think I have loved you since the morning you shook my hand in my office and decided to fiercely fight for your own life. I am saying that helping you heal has been the single best thing I have done in 20 years, and if you feel even a tiny fraction of what I feel for you, I would very much like to see exactly where this goes." Jane stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the desk, and did something she had been desperately wanting to do for months. She reached up, framing his handsome face with her hands, and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant test at first, but when Marco's strong arms immediately wrapped around her waist and pulled her flush against his chest, the kiss deepened into something absolute and certain. It tasted entirely like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing heavily, Marco rested his forehead against hers. "I am all in, Jane," he promised softly. "Permanently." Over the next year, Marco stayed true to every single word. He meticulously transferred his entire organization to a trusted lieutenant, washing his hands of the criminal underworld forever. He moved into a quiet, secure condominium just blocks away from Phoenix House, spending his evenings cooking massive dinners for the shelter residents and offering the kind of steady, safe male presence that most of those women had never experienced without violence attached to it. On the 1-year anniversary of the shelter's opening, Jane stood in the vibrant, laughter-filled garden with Marco proudly by her side, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. She looked at the glowing windows of the home she had built from her own agonizing pain, surrounded by people who actively chose to be there. Her mother had ruthlessly tried to erase her, to turn her into a silent, worthless ghost. Instead, Jane had become a fierce, untouchable force of healing, and she was finally completely alive. And that brings our beautiful story to a close here on Sunni romance. Thank you so much for staying with Jane and Marco through every emotional twist and turn of their incredible journey. I really want to know what you thought about Marco's huge decision to leave his entire empire behind just for love. Would you have been able to forgive and trust someone from such a dangerous background? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments, because I read every single one of them. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story, and I will see you all in the very next video.